Clock ticks down towards the election. More and more political information is being published and broadcast by the various political parties. In some cases, there's plenty of political information that's being published that comes from people who are not political parties but have an agenda. All of this means it can be harder and harder to know what is true and what is not. But several organizations are now working at trying to create tools to help you know when a fact is a fact, or when someone is lying to you, or maybe just twisting things a little bit. One of the new tools is called Crosscheck. It's been produced by the group's First Draft and AfricaCheck. Niousha Roshani is from the organisation First Draft, one of the organisations that's been working on this project. She's here for you now. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me, having me on the show.
So when you see a situation like this, we're in election season. You'll have watched other countries in election season.
Absolutely.
I imagine that's the time when you need to be most on your guard. You need to know that not everyone is telling the truth.
Oh, absolutely. And this is not just a case in South Africa. We have seen this in especially Brazil. I'm not sure if you followed the elections last year. Colombia faced the same exact issue, and obviously the 2016 election disaster in the US.
I mean, what's changed? I mean, if we go back to the 1980s, politicians fibbed then. I mean, one president famously told the Americans there'll be no new taxes. Something seems to have shifted, though. It's not so much about the outright lie. It's about changing the narrative, twisting things, a bit more sophisticated, perhaps?
I would say, I mean, we all know that misinformation, or as Trump likes to call it, fake news, is an old story. But the digital tools and platforms have been used to propagate and then to make information travel much faster and to gain a much wider audience than we usually would have.
Isn't there something a bit more complicated than that as well? It's not just the speed of information. I mean, you can go back 100 years. I think Mark Twain said that a lie goes twice around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoelaces.
Absolutely.
But there's also the idea of an echo chamber. So people only follow certain people on Twitter. They only go to certain Facebook pages.
Absolutely. And I think one of the greatest challenges that while we are able to monitor and trace what is happening on Twitter or Facebook, we're not able to do that on WhatsApp. A lot of the, for example, issues that happen in Brazil is that while we're able to tackle a lot of the misinformation happening on Facebook and Twitter and other platforms, much of the misinformation was traveling via WhatsApp, which is encrypted, as you well know, so it was impossible to tackle it, to address it.
So how then does a normal voter go about telling if a fact is a fact? I mean, where do you even start?
But that's why it's really important that aside from working with journalists and newsrooms who have the responsibility to check the information, we also have to involve civil society organizations, activists, and even your aunts and grandmas, you know, who will be able to, propagates that misinformation, that fake news.
Okay, so what you've got to do then, I mean, is it true, would it be true to say that voters need to actually work a lot harder than they've had to work in the past, perhaps?
Voters, it's really hard because they're being bombarded by information from all sides. But I think that the onus still lies among journalists. So journalists have the responsibility to make sure that the information that they receive, whether in photos or videos or in written form, is indeed, from a true source.
That requires a lot more resources than journalists currently have. I mean, around the world, I realize this, I am one, so of course I'm going to say this, but what you have is more and more demands being placed on journalists at a time when there are fewer and fewer resources.
It's true, and I think that the onus is on them because they're the carrier of information, but we also have, as voters, we should have the right to the right kind of information. So it also lies on two voters to be able to read maybe a wider source of information, ask themselves twice when they get news, via WhatsApp, and maybe check their sources.
Is there a duty also not to pass on false information?
Absolutely. But, I mean, how do you convince, for example, your aunt, your grandma, or my father, who is in his 70s, that when he sends you something, said, this video is real, I can see it, and then to explain to him that that's actually montage? It's quite complicated.
I mean, there's this thing, I don't know if you've seen it in Brazil, but you see it here all the time. People will send a WhatsApp and they say, sent as received, which means they've done no work to check if it's true.
Absolutely. And I think we come to an age where we have this wide consumption. We read the title and we think, okay, we know all the information. We don't go through the hassle of actually reading and analyzing the content of the information.
Is that also because there's more information? And where I'm going with this is that South Africa, again like Brazil, but perhaps more so, has some people who are very information rich. So if you're in Gauteng or Durban or Nelson Mandela Bay, you will have access to a huge range of information. You can have some of the fastest internet in the world. But you might be in another part of the country where you have far less information. In the past, we always thought voters should have as much information as possible. I wonder if people who have access to more information might actually be almost more vulnerable.
I believe that in some ways it could be true, and I think that a lot of times I say that I speak for myself as well. When I read the news, sometimes I don't go in depth with the content of the news I'm reading. So I just read the title, I zap through it, and I think I know of it. So I think that with the amount of information that we've been fed, we actually know less than we used to know before, or at least less in depth.
Okay, so the tools that are available then, I mean, you've been developing some tools, other organizations are developing tools. How do those tools work?
So there are some very creative, innovative tools that happen not just from First Draft, but other organizations. They help you to do, say, a reverse image to make sure that the image that you're seeing is actually true and is not being, is not a montage. Same thing with a video. And people, when it comes to like virtual reality, people are not able to understand that this can actually be done, and the person you see in the video is not actually real. So, but there's also ways that you can check about your Twitter feed and make sure that the information is real. So there are many tools that you can use, and we've been training not just newsrooms, but also civil society organizations and activists and researchers, and bridging the gap between what is happening in research and what is happening in innovative solutions on the ground, and tackling and addressing misinformation.
In the end, you've got a large group of people who are deciding the course of an election, and yet you've got to try and make those tools accessible to them. Do you find that people are actually accessing the tools that are being developed?
I think that there was a high demand. So when we held a couple of events over here, and a lot of the people who were in those participants in these events asked us that they needed more time to practice and use these tools. So there is a demand for this, and I don't think that everybody has. I mean, these tools are widely available and they're open source and they're free. So it's not something that you don't have access to, but many people don't know about them. So I think it's our role as well and our responsibility to make sure that it's accessible to all sectors of society and not just newsrooms.
It's quite interesting because you would have thought that the freest countries in the world, the richest countries in the world, voters would have the most and best information. And yet in the United States, which is one of those countries, not the most open and not the most free perhaps, but one of them, it is there that you start to see the first scandals developing around Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, Absolutely. The idea that actually facts were manipulated or twisted or just lies, and that might actually have changed an election. There's a sort of irony to that.
Definitely, I would say so. But, for example, Twitter has done a lot of studies showing that misinformation on Twitter was much more widely used and distributed and shared than real news, right? So real facts. I think people like sensationalism, so that's something that's, and is very much true to the American case. And not just because you have access to the internet does not mean that you're actually informed. So that's the difference.
I mean, no. Well, I mean, there's a big move in Britain and in other countries, Australia as well, I think, to make the providers, so Facebook and Twitter, responsible.
Absolutely.
Would you support that?
I think there's definitely, we have to make them accountable for making sure that the information that it's really hard for them to be able to do this, but I think that they have a responsibility to have, because they have such a wide, network of users, and I think it is their responsibility. And Europe does a very good job at pushing Facebook, for example, and Twitter, to hold them accountable for everything that happens. And when I'm saying this, I'm not just limiting it to elections. I'm limiting it to other news that have caused, for example, further violence or towards a certain group. So.
It's interesting that, we talk about some countries might be more vulnerable than others. South Africa, again, huge inequality, again, a lot like Brazil, again, very WhatsApp dependent, a lot like Brazil. Does that make us more vulnerable than other countries?
You know, like you brought up the case of the U.S. So, U.S. is a country that's economically much more developed than South Africa or Brazil, but yet misinformation traveled at an alarming rate. So, I would not say that South Africa or Brazil will be vulnerable. I think that it's just, I mean, it's much more, the issue lies much greater than just misinformation. And misinformation is the tool that was used, but it lies on the education and inequality that exists in the country, and white supremacy is one of the issues that, for example, Brazil has been facing for a long time, and that was at the core of Bolsonaro's campaign. So I think that there's just so many factors that come into play, and that misinformation and social networks are just used to propagate those phenomena.
There'll be some people who'll be watching who'll think this only happens during an election campaign. But an election campaign actually starts the day after the last election, because there's also attempts to change the entire narrative over time. I mean, if you look at how people did that, for example, in the Brexit vote, you know, people have been campaigning for 20 years. So some, even if they didn't have Twitter and Facebook. And the point I'm trying to make is that you don't just have to be on your guard during an election. You actually have to be on your guard all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I'm saying that while the onus is on journalists because they spread the information, not just them, but then they're the carrier of information, the onus should be also on civilians. We have to make sure that we think twice about the information that we read and we get. So I've done a lot of research also around, you know, hate speech online, and how hate speech can further, for example, the racial discrimination and exclusion of young Afro-descendants in Latin America. So it's not just an election. I mean, that could be true of what happened in, you know, spreading news around the Ebola, and how that actually excluded, marginalized certain populations, certain targeted populations. So it's, while we focus on elections, because that's where the funding and all the sensationalism, you know, comes into play, it goes much wider than this.
I mean, it's one thing to say that there are various tools, and I'm sure you have favorite tools, you know, tools that you use, and I'll come to those in a moment, but in the end, everyone's just going to go to Google. Isn't Google actually where this problem lies? And that might be unfair to Google, but they make enough money, so I think we can ask them to deal with some of the problem.
No, absolutely. And there's been a lot of talks. I'm not sure if you've been following. There's been, for example, they tried to create advisory boards around tackling the issues that happen with certain digital tools and platforms, or, you know, widely spoken AI. But I'm not sure if they're responding as fast as Facebook, because the first attacks would be on Facebook or Twitter. And a lot of these communities are actually formed on Facebook and Twitter. And because WhatsApp belongs to Facebook, so then the pressure is greater on Facebook. But yes, I agree with you that Google should be held accountable.
It's easy to say that some countries are vulnerable because of inequality, or because of the information that some people have and other people don't. But also, for this to work, you have to have a large number of floating voters. So in Brazil, for example, people have changed who they voted for. In South Africa, not so much. We probably have more floating voters in this election than we've ever had. But most people have probably, since freedom came in 1994, voted for only one political party. Not everyone, obviously, but most people. Would misinformation be less effective in a country where people have quite solid political identities?
I mean, the case of South Africa is quite interesting, but I know that in the case of Brazil, people voted out of fear. Obviously, there was some, you know, the whole rise of white supremacy was into play, but people voted out of fear, out of economic uncertainty, and because they no longer believe in the PT, which is the party of Lula and Dilma Rousseff. So, but in the case of South Africa, is quite different. The historical background played a big role into this, and I think people voted. It was an emotional reaction more than, I would say, logical reaction. But then, you know, and then it's much more complicated. So I'm not going to get into the details of the elections. I've been speaking to a lot of South Africans and trying to get, you know, their different perspective, but it's quite different. I mean, while Brazil and South Africa share a lot of the commonalities and dynamics and inequality, you know, with the dictatorship in Brazil and the PT that, you know, came to power, was in power for a very long time. It's quite different. They didn't have. It wasn't the same kind of government representing the large majority. The majority of Brazil are still Afro-Brazilians, they're more than 60%, but yet the government has always been largely white. So,
the way that human beings have dealt with information and weighted information. So it's one thing if I say to you X, Y, Z, but if I've lied to you a million times, you're going to give it a very low weight. Okay, whereas if I've always told you the truth, you're going to give it a very, very high weight. That's the idea. But the way that human beings weigh information has changed. So when newspapers first came out, a lot of them were scandal sheets and you knew not to trust them. They made up stories about life on Mars and things like that. Then over time they grew credibility, perhaps during wartime and things like that. And then again the press and the news, the media industry now, sensationalism, Fox News, etc., it affects all of us. So then, again, people are looking at it differently. Do you think the same will happen with information online, on Twitter and on Facebook, in that people now may give it a lot of weight, but their children may actually choose to just ignore it because it's just Facebook? It's a very complicated question.
It is a very complicated question that requires a much more elaborate response. It wouldn't be able, I wouldn't make it justice just respond it. But I would say that we're actually discussing that with someone in our previous conversation, that young people are no longer using Facebook. They say they no longer believe in it, right? For different variety of reasons. But I would say that young people are recreating the way their political activism and participation. So I wouldn't be able to respond to what will happen. But the moment I see more and more young people, leaving Facebook and using and joining other platforms.
And of course, we don't know what's going on WhatsApp, and that's the complicated.
That's exactly one of the largest issue. And then while we're able to work, for example, one of the greatest challenges in Brazil when we work with newsrooms is that we work with newsrooms, but we needed to also involve civil society organizations, and especially in a lot of the townships, people from the township, activists who were able to use those tools and think twice about the information. So that was one of the recommendations I would have made for Brazil.
Okay, so someone on my street WhatsApp group sends me a WhatsApp when I get home. I think that can't be true. How do I find out if it is or if it isn't?
Yes, as a user, I think, maybe as an informed, citizen, I think you could check the information. Like you said, you could go on Google and see different views and not just one view. But it will be much, much more difficult because these tools are made available for large newsrooms and for newsrooms in general. But there should be more training with civil society organization, with people, like you say, your everyday person, so they're able to think twice about the information that they get.
It's sometimes tempting as a journalist, and I don't think I would be allowed to do this, but it would be tempting to have, if I ran a newspaper or a website, to have yesterday's biggest lies. In other words, you run, and I mean, it's basically a bigger version of AfricaCheck, which you've been working with, or what you do with First Draft, that you literally have, would require a lot of staff. Scopes does this in the United States, but literally today's biggest lies, and you just choose them on order of importance. We know that Donald Trump would be, the main headline all the time.
Of course.
But do you think that could be something that could work? Because what you're doing is you're punishing the people who lie.
It could be interesting. I'm not sure if First Draft is dealing with it now. One of the tools that they created, which is actually very interesting, is an international platform called Crosscheck International, where newsrooms are able to go as journalists representing newsrooms, and they're able to post one on one of the, whether video, whatever form it takes, and then have other newsrooms and journalists check basically do the verification, and then they will be able to put the logo of the newsrooms, and then at the end you're able to see, okay, is it real, is it not real? So I think that's a really great way to debunk information that is not real. But I'm not sure I would be delighted to see that amongst civilians. So
in other words, there's a stamp of approval from a newsroom. We've checked this.
Absolutely.
And it's fine.
So we had a question, for example, a lot of independent journalists said, what about if we want to check the information, we want to participate? But it was really hard because how do you check the credibility of the journalist? So we're still working on this, but I think for the time being, the idea of having a platform that is international, where people can learn what were the best practices that took place, for example, in Brazil, or in the current, Uruguay is about to go through elections very soon. What happened in the Nigerian elections, and how newsrooms were able to create a coalition and work together to tackle and address the issue of misinformation.
Niousha, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Niousha Roshani is from the organisation First Draft. Of course, we will verify facts for you here on SABC News. Stay with us.